This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. On today's show, as we celebrate Labor Day and the 2012 Democratic National Convention, we chat with Mark Shriver, who wrote a loving biography of his father, Sargent Shriver, who was our party's vice presidential nominee in 1972. We also have a conversation with someone who believes cutting taxes for the rich is an ideological piece of nonsense. That view is held by economist Bruce Bartlett, who was an advisor to Ron Paul, Jack Kemp, Ronald Reagan, and the presidents Bush. He says times have changed and the rich ought to pay their share. And Bill Press talks with Washington Post Nia Malika Henderson about Paul Ryan's blatant untruths. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. 40 years ago, Sargent Shriver, a man for all seasons, was selected to run for vice president. Today, we talk with one of his sons, Mark, who has written a biography of the man he calls a warrior for peace. And he offers some poignant and funny stories. And joining us today on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, Mark Shriver leads the U.S. program of the international group Save the Children. His career fighting for social justice and advocacy and service organizations, as well as elected office, has focused on advancing the right of every child in America to have a safe and vibrant childhood. And he has just written a book called A Good Man, a biography of his father, R. Sargent Shriver. Mark Shriver, thanks so much for joining us again today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thanks for having me on. Really appreciate it.
Well, we always appreciate your time as well. You know, you say in your book that your father, Sargent Shriver, was a warrior for peace. That sounds like an oxymoron. So how would you explain that?
Well, I think he clearly had experienced World War II. He was in law school at Yale, where he went to undergraduate and to law school on scholarships because the family had lost all their money and declared bankruptcy after the Depression. But the day after his final exam, he enrolled in the U.S. Navy and was working for the Navy before Pearl Harbor, and was there actually on active duty on the day Pearl Harbor happened. And he fought in the South Pacific in the Battle of Guadalcanal and the Battle of Santa Cruz. He was on a submarine as well. And what I learned in writing this book is obviously here was a man that had seen the horrors of war, and he chose the name Peace Corps when he created the Peace Corps under the Kennedy administration, because he wanted to signify that they were going to wage peace. Just as America had in the past waged war and other countries had done it. And he used a quotation from the Revolutionary Battle up at the first battle, Lexington and Concord, where it was claimed that I think it was Captain Parker said, "If they mean to have war, let it begin here." And he put up in the entrance to the Peace Corps, "If they mean to have peace, let it begin here." So he believed strongly in peace. He believed strongly that peace was more powerful than war. And could end up with better results and better long-term results. So he wanted to use some of the image of and commitment that had been associated with waging war to show that same type of commitment to waging peace. That's why I use that expression.
Your father died at the age of 95 after a long battle with Alzheimer's disease. What, if anything, did that experience offer you or other Americans?
It's an incredibly challenging, brutal experience. But there are also great moments of insight. There were for me, and I hope there are for others that are struggling with family members that are suffering from Alzheimer's. You know, my dad had it for 10 years. I tell a story in the book, when he was quite ill, probably 3 or 4 years before he died, when I took him out to watch one of my daughter's lacrosse games. And, I, like so many other dads, on the sidelines, I'm screaming encouragement. Some call it encouragement, some just call it screaming. And, he turned to me, he was sitting in a chair, and he turned to me and said, "Did I yell at you like that?" And I thought he had forgotten that I was his kid, or that was his granddaughter out in the field. And it was a moment, I think, of lucidity. And I looked at him, and I was like, I didn't know what to say. And when I thought about it, he never did yell. When I did very well in high school football and scored a touchdown, he treated it the same as when I didn't start the first couple of games of my high school career. He knew sports were important, but he didn't treat it any differently or any more important than anything else in life. He believed in supporting you. And if you did well on the athletic field, he offered encouragement. If you didn't do well, he offered encouragement. And that was an important lesson for me to be reminded of, even though he was in the midst of Alzheimer's and struggling. He was teaching me about how to be a dad. There were other examples when he also had this annoying habit of blowing his nose constantly, and I write about it in the book, that it was frustrating. And one day when we were going into church, he was sitting there. I sat down next to him. We got to Mass a little late, my family and I, and he wanted to hold hands, and I didn't want to catch a cold. I didn't know what was going on. I didn't want the kids to get sick, so I was agitated and irritated. But he just put his hand on my knee, and about 3 minutes later, just turned to me and said, "I love you." And I learned, you've got to love is the basis for everything in life, and patience and forgiveness are also critical lessons he taught me in the fog of Alzheimer's. But I don't want to make it appear that Alzheimer's isn't tough and brutal on families, because it is. It's hard. In this country, we don't spend enough on Alzheimer's research to find a cure, because it's impacting thousands of families, and it's financially and emotionally devastating. We need to do more as a government and as people to really try to solve this terrible disease.
And we, quite frankly, know so little about it, which is pretty mind-boggling at this point in our lives.
Right. That's right.
Your entire family really deeply associated with the Democratic Party. Have you had any experiences with or hopes of bipartisanship in making a better world for children who are born into poverty or with disabilities?
I think, elected politics is, as people have said, a contact sport. There's no question about it. And over the course of our country's history, you see that campaigns can be often very, very difficult and tough. But what I think as a history major, and I've looked back and studied this, I think that there was much more of a commitment to the community of the country, than there is in Washington and frankly, in some state governments today. I think the sense that are you better off today than you were 4 years ago has really made it an individualistic society. And America's had this image of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, but the government and other civic organizations have been there to support the community. And I think we've unfortunately veered too far to an individualistic society, and we've looked out for either the Republican Party or the Democratic Party and not looked out for what's best for America. And I'm hopeful that will swing. It's frustrating. It's frustrating to a lot of folks. And so many people are, in the middle and just want a better life for themselves and for their kids and for the future. I just wish that our elected officials would look to the past and see that even Republicans and Democrats often would compromise for the good of the country. And it doesn't mean you're weak or ill. It means that you care about the country, you care about the community of the United States. And we've gotten away from that, unfortunately.
We were speaking with Mark Shriver, and he leads the U.S. program of the international group Save the Children, and we've been talking about the book, his recent book, A Good Man, a biography of his revered father, our Sargent Shriver. Mark, let's talk a little bit about Save the Children. Tell us about your current work as Senior Vice President of the program, Save the Children, the U.S. program.
Save the Children was created here in the United States about 80 years ago. It grew and has grown really on the international side. A lot of folks know about our work internationally, but we were started as a program focused on poverty in the United States in Kentucky after the Depression. And we're today working in over 200 schools. I run our programs here in the U.S. We're in 200 schools in states that are governorships that are held by both Republicans and Democrats, trying to increase the literacy skills of kids. We have an early childhood program for 0 to 5-year-olds that are living in poverty to try to get those kids and families ready for kindergarten so that those kids are ready to learn. And then for older kids, we run in-school, after-school, and summer programs teaching literacy and running physical activity and nutrition programs because of the obesity epidemic in this country. It's impacting nationally. 1 in 3 kids are either overweight or obese in our programs, and in the communities in which we work, it's almost 1 in 2. 50% of the kids are either overweight or obese. So we're trying to combat that with healthy snacks after school and in the summertime, with physical activity programs after school and in the summertime, and also with teaching literacy, trying to increase the reading skills of kids. If a kid can read at grade level at the end of third grade, they're going to have a better chance of succeeding in elementary and high school and beyond. And if a kid, can read, they're going to be able to do well in school. And then they can realize their dreams. If they can't read, they're going to struggle. They can't do math and science, and those are the kids, unfortunately, that are dropping out of high school. But we focus early, from birth, pre-birth, really, through third grade is our sweet spot. And we're working in states all across the country, from the East Coast to the West Coast, to the South to the Midwest and the upper northern part of the country as well.
Now, you served for a time in the Maryland House of Delegates and then lost a close primary race for Congress. So,
yes.
Is there another run for office in your future?
I lost to Chris Van Hollen in the primary. He's doing a great job, I think, on Capitol Hill. He was a friend when we served together in the Maryland legislature. He still is today. I'm actually doing a book party soon, and he's coming to it, so I'm proud of that relationship. I don't know. I guess you never say never, but I think there's so many different ways to make a contribution in this country. My mom and dad were never elected to office. My father, through his work in creating the Peace Corps and Head Start and legal services for the poor, obviously had the support of important politicians like President Johnson and President Kennedy and others. But he made a profound impact as a bureaucrat, if you will. My mom, probably has had a bigger impact on the lives of people with developmental disabilities than anybody really in the history of the world. And I don't say that casually. Surely more than most, if not every elected official. I think politics is a noble calling. It's kind of corny these days, but I still believe it. So I think the folks that are elected are doing great work at at very little pay, and at great personal cost to them and their families. So I guess I never say never, but I'm happy doing what I'm doing. I love my work at Save the Children. I love actually running programs for kids and trying to make a difference in their lives and in their families' lives. I love being able to be at home with our 3 young kids and my wife. I love them madly, and I love not being out raising money and traveling all across the country. But, you never know.
Okay. You know what? That's a better answer than I thought I was going to get. So,
well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Now, before we let you go, I've got to clear up what may be an apocryphal story, but about when your dad ran for vice president, campaigned among blue-collar workers in a Baltimore bar, bought a round for the House, and then said, "Make mine a Courvoisier." Is it true?
I've heard the story. I've heard it in a Baltimore. I've never heard it in a Baltimore bar. I've heard it in a Pittsburgh bar.
Aha.
Did my father drink Courvoisier? I guess so. I never really had him with him. I'd had vodka tonics with him. I have had beer with him. I've had a couple glasses of wine with him. Whether he did it or not, I mean, look, the bottom line is I think what people were trying to do is to paint him as an aristocrat. I think that if you look at his history, his family had some money, and they had been involved in Maryland state government for over 200 years. They had a big working mill in western Maryland. The family was prominent in political and social circles in Maryland, and he was very, very proud of it. His family also lost all their money in the Depression, and he had to work himself, get scholarships and grants and gifts from people to work himself through high school, through Yale Law School and Yale undergrad. And then he, went in the Navy. So he was not rolling in the dough. If he ever had a belt at a bar, then it was a Courvoisier. Good for him. If he didn't, maybe he should have ordered one. So it may be made up. It may not be. The bottom line is he was a good man, and he loved his family and his kids and his wife, and he did a lot of great stuff. And he liked vodka tonics too, because I can tell you I had a few with him, and he was fun. It was a lot of fun.
If they can't even decide if the bar was in Pittsburgh or Baltimore, I'm going to guess that this was just some sort of unfair dig.
It's okay. Who cares? It's funny. You got to laugh, and that he was joyful, So I don't think he never complained about that story, and frankly, he never complained about any other, any of the defeats he had in politics or any of the, perceived shortchanges that might have happened in his career. He was joyful. He laughed. And people ought to laugh at it, too. I mean, our family's had a couple laughs about that story. and onward and upward. Life is good.
Absolutely. Mark, we appreciate your time with us. Mark Shriver, who leads the U.S. program for the international group Save the Children. The book is A Good Man, a biography of his revered father, R. Sargent Shriver. Mark, thank you so much again for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up in just a few minutes, former Reagan and Bush economic advisor Bruce Bartlett says the Republican mantra that lower taxes will lead to higher growth and more jobs is an idea that simply denies reality. But right now we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Happy Labor Day! And what a good day it is. For only 5 years after that ugly Wall Street collapse, the Dow Jones average has soared back above 13,000 and top executive paychecks are at zippity-doo-dah levels. The only little cloud over this otherwise sunshiny recovery is, well, you people for whom Labor Day is named, that is. Not only did Wall Street's crash knock jobs, wages, benefits, home ownership, and middle-class opportunities into the ditch, but they're still stuck there, and even sinking lower. Yet the financial elites, political establishment, and media powers remain rapturously focused on the Dow, uncaring about the precipitous decline in the Doug Jones average. If Doug and Donna aren't prospering, neither is America, no matter how much wealth the privileged ones are socking away in offshore tax havens. The stark status of the Doug is revealed in a recent report on laid-off workers. Of the 6.1 million Americans who lost stable jobs since 2009, when the recovery officially began, nearly half are still out of work. Also, more than half of those who did find jobs had their pay cut, whacking their standard of living. Typical of these is Andrew McMenemy, whose software firm pulled the plug on his $80,000 a year high-tech job in 2010. He has finally found another job, but it pays under $20,000 a year with no benefits. At 53 years of age, McMenemy has had to move in with his father. This is Jim Hightower saying, knocking down the middle class is economically stupid, socially dangerous, and morally wrong. Labor Day is a good time to face up to the fact that today's corporate and political leaders are wretchedly bad gardeners. By tending to the moneyed elites and ignoring America's workaday majority, they're watering the weeds and pulling the flowers. Where in the world is that going to lead us?
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Now that Republicans have swallowed the Kool-Aid of low taxes as a cure for everything, we hear from an advisor to GOP leaders from Ron Paul to George Bush. Economist Bruce Bartlett explains the obvious, that if we don't raise taxes on the wealthy, the rest of us have to pay more. And joining us now on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, Bruce Bartlett, who had an impeccable credentials as a conservative economist on Capitol Hill and as an advisor to both President Reagan and President George H.W. Bush. He has more recently become a critic of some conservative economic and tax policies and is an advocate of comprehensive tax reform, as explained in his new book from Simon & Schuster, The Benefit and the Burden, Tax Reform, Why We Need It and What It Will Take. Bruce Bartlett, thanks very much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Happy to be here.
So about 25 years ago, Congress passed and President Reagan signed a major tax reform. But since then, the tax code has grown more complicated and resulted in a growing inequality in the tax burden. In your new book, you call for a massive new overhaul of the tax system. What would that look like?
Well, my own personal ideas are still kind of evolving, but certainly there is an enormous need to cut away the brush and the weeds that have grown up in the tax code of special deals and tax credits and tax deductions, and of course Congress is constantly looking to add new ones. The Republicans, for example, are pushing a special 1-year small business tax cut for every business in the United States with fewer than 500 employees, no matter how profitable or financially large they may be. And there's simply no evidence that this will have any impact on growth or employment. But it's very popular, so there's constantly pressure to keep doing more of these things.
One of the chapters in your book is titled, "What Should We Do About the Bush Tax Cuts?" So what should we do about them?
Well, ideally, what we would like to be able to do, or should be trying to do, is use this action-forcing event as a driver of some sort of tax reform that would replace the Bush tax cuts as well as the expiring temporary cut in the payroll tax with better tax cuts that would be more conducive to growth and that would also raise net revenues for the federal government because I think that's the single most important thing we need to be doing in the area of tax policy right now. Unfortunately, this being an election year, there's just about no possibility of this happening. We're very, very early in the stages of debate over tax reform, and there's simply no possibility that anything will be done before the end of the year, partly because both parties think they're going to strengthen their hand in the elections, and obviously that they both can't be right. But as long as they think so, they'll think that they're better off waiting until after the election. So more than likely they'll just kick the can down the road and do another temporary extension of the Bush tax cuts in a lame duck session.
Mm-hmm. Now, even though it may not raise a lot of revenue, is President Obama's Buffett rule, the higher taxes on million-dollar incomes, important as a symbol of fairness, and is the progressive income tax still advisable?
Well, I think we need to have progressivity for fairness and equity. I'm not exactly a fan of the Buffett rule. It's clearly a gimmick, but it's one worth debating because I think it focuses people's attention on a deeper problem, which is I think everybody's going to have to pay more taxes in the future, and the wealthy are going to have to pay a lot more for the simple reason that they have more money than the rest of us. And if taxes are rising and we don't raise taxes on the wealthy, then the rest of us are going to have to pay more. So I think that we need to raise the effective tax rate on the wealthy. The Buffett rule is probably not a good way to do it, at least legislatively. Conceptually, I have no problem with the idea of millionaires having an effective federal tax rate of at least 30%. But the way they're trying to do it is too gimmicky, in my opinion.
But at least it gets the conversation started?
That's right. I think the Democrats are trying to find their voice in terms of responding to the Republicans' constant pressure to cut spending for every program, and and they're saying, okay, well, instead of cutting spending, why don't we raise taxes on the rich? And so, and that's very popular politically. Every single poll that I've looked at for the last 2 years has shown that the American people support higher taxes on the wealthy by roughly a 2-to-1 margin. So the Democrats are finally learning how to play the Republican game, and they're just beating this for as long as they can get traction out of it.
We're speaking with Bruce Bartlett, former advisor to both President Reagan and President George H.W. Bush, the author of The Benefit and the Burden, Tax Reform, Why We Need It and What It Will Take. Bruce, what's your view about the Republican mantra that Democrats are engaging in class warfare? I mean, the warfare goes both ways, does it not?
That's right. The Republicans' class warfare is simply the flip side. They keep saying, well, the reason we have deficits and insufficient revenues is because there are too few people paying taxes. And they keep ranting about how the 50% or so of people who are tax filers who have no federal income tax liability. Of course, the main reason they have no income tax liability is because they have very little income. So it's perfectly appropriate that those people not be taxed. And the idea that we're going to get significant revenues by taxing the poor is simply nonsensical. But it's basically the Republicans' version of class warfare. It's all the fault of the poor and lazy people who won't get jobs and are living in hammocks on unemployment compensation and things of that sort.
You mentioned a moment ago about two-thirds of Americans, and I'll add almost half of Republicans, support tax increases as part of a deficit reduction plan. If that's the case, so why are Republican politicians in such lockstep against any tax increases, and how do they get out of the hole that you say they've dug for themselves?
Well, it's partly two things. One is ideological. They're simply absolutely convinced that lower taxes, especially on the wealthy, is indeed the key to economic growth. But, of course, to hold that opinion, they simply have to ignore all the economic evidence to the contrary. If tax cuts were the key to growth, we should have had massive increase in growth after the Bush tax cuts in 2003. Well, I don't remember any boom during that time period. And they also have to ignore the fact that we had a substantial increase in growth after the big tax increases of 1982 and 1993. So basically, they just have to deny reality to cling to this ideological view. And of course, the second problem is that the Republican Party, even more so than the Democratic Party, is financed by the ultra wealthy, and they're simply doing what is in their own personal best interest. And organizations like the Club for Growth and Freedom Works and other organizations funded by billionaires like the Koch brothers, put enormous amounts of money into Republican primaries. And so any Republican who dares to say, well, gee, maybe we just ought to think a little bit about raising taxes on the wealthy, those people get primaried and in many cases get defeated for such heresy, and this enforces party discipline.
Now, you began your political career working for Ron Paul. You were a supply-side advisor to President Reagan and a Treasury official under George H.W. Bush. You have since blasted George W. Bush for causing the 2009 recession. How did you come to your current views, and do you feel like a heretic?
Well, yeah, I think apostate is probably a more accurate description. But look, my view has always been that you analyze the specific economic conditions of the time, and you promote policies that are appropriate to dealing with those specific conditions. And what has happened is that conditions have changed. I fully support the things that I did when I was working back for Jack Kemp and Ronald Reagan. I think the Reagan tax cut of 1981 was excellent legislation, as was the Tax Reform Act of 1986. But I think the idea that it worked once, so let's just keep doing it again and again and again is nonsense. And I think the objective facts of the situation today say that that tax cuts are very, very unlikely to have any positive stimulative effect. And on the contrary, I think that to the extent that we have a looming budgetary problem, a debt problem, it's to a very large extent the result of insufficient revenues. When George W. Bush took office in 2001, there was about a $6 trillion debt. And the Congressional Budget Office was then projecting that if policies remained on automatic pilot that we would run a $6 trillion surplus over the next 10 years. We would have paid off the debt. But instead, at the end of that 10-year period, we had a $12 trillion debt. So basically, the Bush tax cuts took away about half of that, and additional spending for wars and new entitlement programs such as Medicare Part D increased spending by about $6 trillion. And so we went from having a zero debt potentially to a $12 trillion debt. And Republicans simply deny that revenues had anything to do with it, when clearly they had an enormous amount to do with it.
If you do take away those wars, the money spent on the wars, is that original number anywhere close to accurate, or is it still way off base and we would not, in fact, had a surplus?
Oh, we wouldn't have had. Well, it depends on what you think would have happened to the economy.
Yeah.
I mean, clearly, if you take into account the slower than expected growth plus the recession, which everybody forgets began in December of 2007, then clearly we would not have achieved those numbers. But nevertheless, it's clear that a very substantial portion of the budgetary deterioration that we've seen over the last 10 years and will continue to see is due to much lower than revenues than we would ordinarily be getting at this stage of the business cycle. For example, at the lowest point during the Reagan administration, federal revenues were 1.5 percentage points of GDP higher than they are right now. So, you'd have to go back to the 1940s to find 3 or 4 years in a row in which revenues have been as low as a share of GDP as they are right now. So clearly, we are not overtaxed. Low taxes are contributing heavily to the deficit. And if I had my druthers, I would just let all the Bush tax cuts expire. But I have no confidence that Obama will allow that to happen.
Okay. The book is The Benefit and the Burden, Tax Reform, Why We Need It, and What It Will Take. Bruce Bartlett is the author. Bruce, thank you so much for your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Okay, thanks.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press talks with the Washington Post's Nia Malika Henderson about Paul Ryan's blatant untruths.
Talking about the second night of the Republican National Convention and the Rock'em Sock'em speech by Paul Ryan, who I think gave the speech that Chris Christie was expected to give. It was a big red meat speech last night. But even Fox News said one of the three words they used for the speech, they called it dazzling, distracting, and deceptive. And Huffington Post this morning, the headline is they're calling it Paul Tales. Ryan misleads again and again. On the scene in Tampa, one of 15,000 reporters down there covering this whole shindig. Our good friend, national political reporter Nia Malika Henderson for the Washington Post. Nia Malika, good morning.
Hey.
You having fun down there?
I am. It's been a lot of fun. Thankfully, the storm passed us over. It looks like the folks in New York.
Yeah, I've seen you popping up on the air here and there. So there's always good opportunities for reporters at these national conventions. So what is the take? Paul Ryan certainly was thrilled the crowd, brought them to their feet many times last night.
Did, and a lot of red meat in that speech, and on TV, Paul Ryan has a pretty good presence. He looks very boyish. He's got that mop of black hair and those puppy dog blue eyes, and so in that way, I think he struck a balance in some ways. But I do think if you go back and fact check that speech, a lot falsehoods in that speech about his own culpability in some of the spending, Bull Simpson, and so I think it may have played well, obviously, in that theater, in that hall last night, and in some ways maybe even beyond the hall. But I think when people go back and look at it, it's like, well, he didn't quite present who he was or even what the Republican platform would be.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. Romney, one of the Romney pollsters, is quoted this morning as saying, "We will not be dictated to by fact checkers." But that's sort of our job. And as you mentioned, one. I mean, there's several. But let me give you quickly just three of them. The GM plant, right? Obama didn't shut it down. It shut down before Obama became president, and we know Mitt Romney opposed the whole auto bailout.
Right.
The Simpson Bowls. Paul Ryan was on the commission, and he voted against the recommendations of Simpson Bowles. The stimulus. He ended up voting for the stimulus and tried to get money out of the stimulus. So I guess my question is, can they just get away with either misstatements or lies like this?
Well, that's certainly what they're going to try, and we've seen this, of course, with the welfare ad
and on the Medicare.
On Medicare, just blatant untruths in terms of what Obama's record is. And, I think it is up to newspapers. I think it's up to the fact-checking departments at these newspapers to certainly call them out on these misrepresentations of their record. But I think the thing about politics often, it's about storytelling and about propaganda in some ways, and these sorts of campaigns that people run and campaign ads that they run, they don't always have to be true to be effective, and it's obviously going to be up to, as I said, newspapers to call them out, and obviously the Obama campaign will do the same thing. I mean, obviously when that speech was going on, you had the Obama campaign sending out, blasting us with corrections.
Oh, they have been, they've been very aggressive on that, point by point by point.
Yeah.
Now, I thought a key point of the Ryan speech last night, they have made a strategic decision, I'm sure you've talked to them about it, to make Medicare a centerpiece of their campaign. And Ryan last night said, "We welcome this debate. We will win this debate." So what are they telling you? Really, they think Republicans can go out as the protectors and the defenders of Medicare when their program would, in fact, end it, as we know it, as they say.
And notice that they aren't really talking about that. They're not talking about the fact that they would voucherize Medicare, privatize it.
Didn't mention voucher last night, did he?
They did not mention the V word. And what they are doing, and I think in some ways they're doing it very effectively, and the Democrats have been put back on their heels on this, have been put on the defensive. They are framing it, as if Obama is raiding Medicare, $716 billion, and it's actually savings and in payments to providers, insurance companies,
right?
Yeah, and so, but they, I think it was just a couple of days after Ryan was the pick, they blasted all of these swing state voters with these ads framing Obama's position on Medicare incorrectly, of course. And then they had the whiteboard.
It seems to me the strategy can only work, right, if the American people don't know the facts, right? Don't know the facts about what Obama is doing and what Ryan and Romney would do to Medicare and to Medicaid.
That's right, and I think that's why you have
to. That's a big gamble.
Yeah, that's a big gamble. Democrats have to, I think, really go a little harder on this in terms of their advertising, in terms of their own messaging, really putting what the Ryan plan would be out there. But I think in the I don't know if it was we did a poll or Times did a poll, they showed that Republicans are winning this fight on Medicare, and in some ways they have to win it because that is the only way. I mean, they cannot lose seniors. If their hope is to win this re-election, they're going to have to really do much, much better than McCain did with seniors. I think McCain only won seniors by about 3 or 4 or 5 points, and if they've got a prayer for winning this election, they've got to swell older voters, they've got to swell working class white voters. So they're they've got a real mountain to climb in terms of their path to the White House, because I think it's just harder for them in general because they just have a more limited routes. But it's really interesting the way they have not. I mean, they have run away from their own record and they've hit Obama incorrectly on what he would do. But so far they are they're fine to do this.
Give me
what they think their strategy will be.
Hate to do this. Give me a quick 30 seconds on what does Mitt Romney have to do tonight?
I think Mitt Romney's got to go back to the humanizing. I don't think Ann Romney did it very well. I think that bio video is going to be very important tonight. I think we'll probably maybe hear more about his Mormonism, at least in that glossy bio video that is standard at these types of things. And then I think he's got to just come across as a credible leader. He's got to come across as a more moderate person to appeal to independent women, to Latinos, and to possibly even African Americans, because I think so far they haven't been able to do that.
I'd like to see him come out in his Mormon bishop garb. I think
I don't know about that.
Hey, so listen, thank you so much, Nia Malika, for joining us. Look forward to getting you back in the studio soon, okay?
Great, thanks, Bill.
All right, enjoy it down there. And unfortunately, we found Nia Malika's not going to be in Charlotte next week.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Mark Shriver, Bruce Bartlett, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us, support the show, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org